Here's something most people get wrong about July 4th, 1776. Almost nobody signed anything that day. No bell rang across the city in celebration. The steeple was rotting, and half the town wasn't even sure the bell still worked. Most of the men who put their names on the Declaration of Independence didn't do it until August 2nd, a full month later in secret, because signing was a one-way ticket to the gallows if the British won. So if the moment we've all been taught to picture, the bell, the crowd, the signatures, is mostly myth, what actually happened in Philadelphia that summer? The real story is stranger, messier, and honestly more interesting than the postcard version. Let's rebuild it, brick by brick, smell by smell, using tax rolls, ship manifests, court records, and diaries from the people who were actually there. It's the summer of 1776. Philadelphia is the largest city in British North America. Bigger than Boston, bigger than New York, with somewhere around 40,000 people packed into 2 square miles along the Delaware River. It's also quietly one of the most dangerous places on the continent to be a revolutionary. Everyone inside that state house on Chestnut Street knows exactly what happens to men convicted of treason against the crown. It isn't a quick death. It's a public one. And yet this is the city they chose. Not Boston, where the fighting had already started. Not Virginia, where most of the wealth was. Philadelphia, because Philadelphia was built to make an idea like independence spread. Walk through London in 1776 and you're navigating streets laid down in the Middle Ages. Narrow, crooked, built for foot traffic and open sewers. Walk through Philadelphia and you're on a grid. This was William Penn's doing, nearly a century earlier. He'd survived the Great Fire of London and watched the city rebuild itself into the same chaotic tangle it had always been. He wanted something different for his colony, what he called a green country town. Streets running north-south got numbers. Streets running east-west got named after trees. Walnut, chestnut, spruce, pine. A newcomer could learn to navigate the entire city in an afternoon. By 1776, that experiment had matured into something startling for the era. Paved brick sidewalks instead of mud, more than 600 whale oil street lamps lighting the major roads at night, and Market Street, then called High Street, stretching a full 100 feet wide enough for 4 wagons to pass abreast. A visitor stepping off a ship from Bristol or Glasgow wasn't arriving at a colonial outpost. They were arriving somewhere that, by 18th century standards, looked like it belonged to the future. But that grid didn't rise on empty ground. This land belonged to the Lenape people for thousands of years before Penn ever drew a straight line on paper. Penn's early treaties with them were, by the standards of colonial America, unusually fair. But by 1776, generations of land pressure, disease, and broken agreements, like the notorious 1737 walking purchase, had already pushed most Lenape communities out of the region entirely. So the orderly brick city the founders debated inside wasn't just a monument to Enlightenment planning. It was also built on a story of displacement that rarely makes it into the textbooks. And it's worth remembering as we walk these streets. Push past the grid in the architecture, and you find the real engine of the place, its people. In 1776, Philadelphia was arguably the most linguistically diverse city in the English-speaking world, including London. Walk down 2nd Street and in a single block you'd hear German, Welsh, Scots Gaelic, French from Huguenot refugees, and multiple West African languages carried by both enslaved people and free black Philadelphians. At the top of the social order sat the Quakers, Penn's original settlers, still the wealthiest merchant class, though their political grip was loosening fast. Right behind them came German immigrants, who by some estimates made up close to a third of Pennsylvania's population. So many, in fact, that Benjamin Franklin worried in print that English might eventually lose ground as the colony's dominant language. Below them was the class actually doing the work of building a revolution, the artisans, silversmiths, tanners, shipwrights, printers. Unlike England's rigid class system, a skilled tradesman in Philadelphia could genuinely rise, buy property, join a militia company, even get elected to city office. That mobility is part of why so many artisans became the loudest voices for independence. They had more to gain from a new order than the merchant elite did. And down at the docks, you'd find Portuguese and Sephardic Jewish merchants negotiating trade deals, free black entrepreneurs running shops and skilled trades, and enslaved Africans forced to carry the same cargo the free men around them were profiting from. This wasn't a melting pot in the sentimental sense. It was closer to a pressure cooker. Different communities packed onto the same 22 blocks, mostly tolerating each other, occasionally colliding, and collectively creating the only environment in the colonies where an idea as radical as independence could actually take root and spread. Morning started around 5 a.m., when the bells of Christ Church rang out over the rooftops. Almost immediately, the city's real soundtrack kicked in, iron-rimmed wagon wheels clattering over cobblestones, a bone-rattling clack that didn't stop until dark. Step outside and the air hit you first. Wood smoke from thousands of cooking fires, the heavy stink of horse manure that had to be shoveled off the streets daily, and depending on the wind, a briny, low-tide smell rolling off the Delaware. Street vendors turned the sidewalks into a live broadcast. A woman selling spiced tripe soup called out, "Pepper pot, all hot." Oyster sellers pushed barrows straight from the docks. Blacksmiths kept a constant metallic rhythm going from the alleys. And everywhere taverns. Philadelphia had somewhere north of 120 licensed drinking houses for a population of 40,000, roughly one for every 300 residents, an almost absurd density even by colonial standards. These weren't just bars. They were where deals got made, news got argued over, and, as we'll get to, where a lot of actual revolutionary planning happened over tankards of ale. Running down the center of High Street was the longest covered outdoor market in the colonies. Brick sheds with arched roofs stretching for blocks, packed with more food than most European visitors had ever seen in one place. This mattered more than it sounds. In London or Paris, the urban poor in 1776 were often surviving on gray bread and thin gin. In Philadelphia, even a working blacksmith could reasonably expect meat on his table most days of the week. Sides of beef, fresh shad, and sturgeon pulled straight from the Delaware, oysters the size of a hand, and produced rolling in from some of the richest farmland on the continent, much of it grown by German farmers out of Lancaster County. That abundance isn't just a nice historical detail. It's arguably one of the underrated engines of the revolution itself. People with full stomachs and steady trade have the bandwidth to sit in a tavern and argue about natural rights and taxation. Desperation doesn't usually produce political philosophy. Prosperity, ironically, often does. If the market was the city's stomach, its print shops were closer to its nervous system. And this is where Philadelphia's real advantage over every other colonial city becomes obvious. By 1776, Philadelphia had more printers, more newspapers, and more pamphlet output than any other city in North America. The legacy of decades of Benjamin Franklin building out the colony's publishing infrastructure. A skilled printer and an apprentice, working a hand-cranked wooden press, could turn out roughly 250 sheets an hour. Every letter of type set by hand, one piece of lead at a time. In January of that year, a struggling former corset maker named Thomas Paine published a 47-page pamphlet through Philadelphia printer Robert Bell. He called it Common Sense. Within months, it had sold an estimated 500,000 copies in a colonial population of roughly 2.5 million people, proportionally equivalent to a single book selling around 60 to 70 million copies in the U.S. today. It was read aloud in taverns, passed hand to hand in army camps, and it did more to shift public opinion toward independence than almost anything the Continental Congress said officially. And here's a detail that rarely makes it into the popular story. The actual physical document most people picture. The elegant, engrossed parchment declaration with John Hancock's giant signature wasn't what went out on July 4th, 1776. What went to the printer that night was a plain broadside, rushed out by a Scottish-born printer named John Dunlap, working through the night in his shop just off Market Street. Roughly 200 copies were struck off and sent out by courier and newspaper before most delegates had even signed anything. The famous signed parchment version wasn't finalized until weeks later, and the bulk of signatures weren't added until August 2nd. The bell in the State House yard, the one now called the Liberty Bell, almost certainly did not ring in celebration that week. Its steeple was in disrepair, and there's no reliable contemporary account of it being rung on July 4th at all. That detail was added to the legend decades later. None of this landed on a unified city. Philadelphia in 1776 was arguably at war with itself before it was at war with Britain. On one block, a printer risking his neck to run rebel pamphlets. Next door, a merchant whose entire livelihood depended on trade with London, watching the Continental Congress as a mob of dangerous radicals about to destroy everything he'd built. The Quakers, pacifists by doctrine, found themselves squeezed from both sides, unable to take up arms for the cause, and increasingly suspected by patriots of secretly favoring the crown. Loyalists and patriots worshipped in the same churches, bought bread from the same market stalls, and increasingly reported on each other to local committees of safety. Being publicly neutral in the summer of 1776 wasn't a safe middle ground. It was often treated as its own kind of guilt. And a few blocks from where Jefferson was drafting language about all men being created equal, roughly 1,500 enslaved people were still living and working inside Philadelphia's city limits. As domestic servants, dock workers, and skilled tradesmen, their labor quietly propping up the same economy that was funding the rebellion. Several delegates inside that state house owned other human beings. Franklin himself had owned slaves earlier in life, though by 1776 his views were shifting toward the abolitionist position he'd championed in his final years. But Philadelphia also held one of the largest free black communities in the colonies, a community that would, within a few decades, produce figures like Richard Allen and Absalom Jones, who built some of the first independent black religious and civic institutions in the country. In 1780, Pennsylvania would become the first state to pass a law for the gradual abolition of slavery, not because the revolution automatically delivered on its own promise, but because people who'd watched that promise get made were the ones who forced the issue. For Philadelphia's black residents in the summer of 1776, independence wasn't an abstract debate about taxes. It was a direct test of whether unalienable rights meant anything at all, or whether it was just convenient language for people who already had power. That night, according to his own weather journal, because Thomas Jefferson genuinely kept a daily temperature log, it was around 76 degrees Fahrenheit at sunrise on July 4th, climbing into the low 90s by afternoon. Even the man writing "All men are created equal" was, in that exact moment, just another person sweating through a Philadelphia summer, worrying about the weather along with everything else. In a little over a year, British troops would occupy these same streets, and several of the men who debated treason inside that state house would become fugitives. But on this night, Philadelphia was still just a city, loud, diverse, contradictory, and betting everything on an idea nobody had proven could actually work. If you want to see another city rebuilt this way, tell me which one in the comments, and I'll take you there next.